Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Dear professors, Professor Cheryl Saunders, Professor Satya Arinanto, Head of International Cooperation, Dr. Ari Afriansyah, also from IDEA Australia, Bang Adi. Welcome also our senior colleges, particularly from Constitutional Department, and also beloved students. How are you today? How are you good this morning? Good? Okay. Great. So this morning we will have, I think, a very fruitful discussion. We will learn about how the title of the session is "What If?" Is it like the Avengers movie? Yeah. What if? What if the Australia becomes a republic? Yeah, I mean maybe this might be a uncommon issue here in Indonesia, but if we have learned from history in Australia, they have been discussed this since maybe 70s, 80s. And finally in 1999, they decide to have a referendum. The people should choose whether they want to change the constitution to become a republic and have a president and become also leave the Commonwealth. But the situation in 1999, there are only 45% that the people say yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Cheryl. Thank you. So yeah, we will learn more from Professor Cheryl, and also we will learn more the response from our Professor Satya Arinanto. So without further ado, I would like to invite our honorable professors. Please, Professor Cheryl Saunders and Professor Satya Arinanto. So before Professor Cheryl deliver his lecture, I will also want to read some of his resume. Professor Cheryl Saunders is a laureate professor emeritus at Melbourne Law School. Her expertise is, I'm sorry, can I get your permission to? Her expertise is in comparative public law, also in constitutional law, in particular in Australia. Some of her contribution in publications is about constitution in Australia, constitutional analysis, and also federal system in Australia. She made contribution in constitutional changes in some countries like Fiji, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Iraq, and Nepal. And also she right now acts as a president emeritus in International Association of Constitutional Law. Am I right, Professor? Okay. And then we will have the session from Professor Satya Arinanto, our beloved professors. Of course, his expertise is in constitutional law. He made contribution in the changing of our constitution in back in 1999 to 2002. And also he served in the vice presidential office. But in this session, he will respond on the what if the Australia becomes a republic. So, are you ready, students? Okay. Please, Professor, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Now, can I stand over there and you do the... Yeah, okay. This might be easier if... Which is the... Brilliant. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be back at the law school at the University of Indonesia. Professor Arananto tells me I was here 30 years ago, and I think I still remember parts of your beautiful campus. So thank you to my colleagues at the law school here for inviting me to deliver this lecture. And thanks to you all for coming. It's wonderful to have so many people in the room and so many online. Now, the topic I was asked to speak about is what if Australia becomes a republic? I'm not sure that I'm quite going to address that subject. I mean, it's a bit speculative. Who knows? But what I'm going to try to do is to explain a little bit about what might happen between here and there. So I'm going to outline the existing Australian constitutional framework as it affects that move from monarchy to republic. I'm going to examine the reasons for such a change and the arguments that might exist against it. Explain what will be involved in Australia becoming a republic, including the key challenges that need to be met, building on some of the problems in 1999 that our chair referred to, and then we'll end up by considering what might happen and when. Of course, the main focus of all of this is going to be on Australia, but I will also be talking a little bit about the position in other countries, both within and outside the Commonwealth of Nations. And the Commonwealth of Nations, as you may know, is the international organisation that has really succeeded to the British Empire. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in due course as well. So let me start with some basic points, and I apologise if you already know all this. So Australia is presently a constitutional monarchy, as we know. The monarch in the United Kingdom is also called the King or Queen of Australia. The King or Queen of Australia, presently the King, of course, is also the Australian head of state. But the King or Queen is rarely here, of course, and so is represented at the national level in Australia by a Governor-General. And for all practical purposes, it's the Governor-General who acts as the head of state. Despite all that, Australia is a fully independent state, and it became independent as a result of gradual evolution over the course of the 20th century. But when the Constitution was first made in 1901, Australia was not fully independent. And of course the Constitution reflects that fact. And the text of the Constitution was not changed as Australia became independent. Instead, there were changes to the practices that were followed in applying the Constitution, and I'd be happy to elaborate on how that all works in question time if you want to follow it up. So for example, whereas in 1901, the monarch was just the monarch for all the countries in the British Empire, now the monarch is called King of Australia for Australian purposes, King of Canada for Canadian purposes, etc. And now also the Governor-General is appointed by the monarch, but on the advice, not on the advice of the monarch, that's a mistake on the slide, on the advice of the Prime Minister. So against that background, think what it means to become a republic. In the Australian context, becoming a republic is understood to involve, first of all, breaking the link with the Crown, secondly, providing for a head of state in some other way, and maybe doing nothing else. It might be that other changes would be made to the Australian system of government, but that's not necessarily the case. The main point is to break the link with the Crown and to provide a substitute head of state. Now, all the 50, more than 50, are now independent states who once were colonies of the British Empire have faced this move from colony to republic, or might do so in the future. Some of them, for example, Singapore, became republics at the time of independence. And interestingly, Malaysia instead became a sort of an indigenous monarchy at the time of independence. Other former colonies, for example, the Caribbean country of Barbados, became republics after independence. In fact, Barbados only became a republic last year. But there are 14 of those former colonies, including Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and Canada, that still retain their links with the monarchy and therefore call themselves constitutional monarchies. So, and those 14 states are facing these issues in the same way that Australia is. I should end this slide, though, by saying that all 50 of these former colonies, or almost all of them, are still member states of the Commonwealth of Nations. And the discussion in Australia about whether to become a republic has nothing to do with membership of the Commonwealth. Everybody assumes that Australia would remain a member of the Commonwealth, and in a way, the King is also the head of the Commonwealth. Yeah. Yeah, there isn't. Of the online people. Sorry, we're trying to fix the echo. Huh? Is that no? Maybe everybody else should turn this off. Is that a little bit better? Not much. Okay. All right, so let's move on by saying, well, for all these countries who have become republics or who might still do, what's driving the move to republicanism in the sense in which I'm using the term? And there's a whole range of different factors that we might point to. One is a feeling that the link with the Crown is now out of date and doesn't reflect the identity of the state, most of which long since has been independent. There's a second reason. In many countries, breaking the link with the Crown is regarded as the last formal step in decolonisation. And indeed, what we're seeing around the world, particularly in the Caribbean, is a new feeling of resentment about the effects of colonisation and the situation in which it left these various states. And then sometimes republicanism is driven by dissatisfaction with the way the system works in practice. For example, if the Governor-General makes a mistake, that generally triggers concern about the constitutional monarchy. But there are also factors that favour keeping the monarchy, or at least not bothering to change it. One is simply inertia. That's the system that's in place. If it's working okay, why would you change it? A second reason against change is that it's hard to agree on an alternative. Probably one of the main reasons, at least in the Australian context. And then another reason is continuing affection for the monarchy. Certainly there was a lot of affection for the Queen before She died, and it remains to be seen what difference her death will make to Republican sentiment. It's now not moving. Okay, thanks. And you can see the reasons for this in Australia, echoing those that are experienced elsewhere in the Commonwealth. The issue of identity is a big issue. We all watched the funeral of the Queen, and it seemed very outdated, very foreign. There's definitely a sense that the link with the monarchy doesn't any longer, and probably hasn't for a long time, reflected the real identity of modern Australia, which is a very multicultural, very pragmatic, really, society. And another issue occasionally driving republicanism is controversies involving the Governor-General. There was a big controversy a long time ago in 1975, but memories of that still linger. And more recently, there have been other controversies involving the Governor-General. I won't bore you with the details now, but I can tell you about them if you're interested. But again, in Australia, as elsewhere, there are arguments against becoming a republic. The most common one is, if it isn't broken, why fix it? It's working okay. We've got other problems to deal with, climate change, pandemics. Why would we engage with this problem unnecessarily? A second reason against change is it is so hard in the Australian context to agree on the alternative for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. And until quite recently, a third reason against change was affection for the Queen, and we've said already that it's pretty hard to work out how her death is going to affect that. So in explaining the challenges that Australia faces in moving to a republic, let me take you to three key aspects of the Australian constitutional system that contribute to this challenge. And the first is the federal structure of the country. Australia is a federation with a dualist design. And what dualism means in this context is that institutions tend to be replicated at both levels of government. So both levels of government have parliaments, both have courts, both have governments, both have human rights commissions, etc. One consequence of dualism is that each of the 6 states at the subnational level of government has a constitution of its own. Of course, those constitutions are subject to the national constitution, but otherwise they are the constitutions of the individual states. Each of the states also has its own relationship with the monarch, who is represented in the state by a governor, who is appointed by the monarch, but acts on the advice of the state government. And so moving to a republic would require those links at the state level to be broken as well. It would be necessary to amend each state constitution following whatever amendment procedures are laid down. And it would be necessary at the state level as well to find an alternative to the office of governor to do the sorts of things that the governor does. So that's the first bit of the Australian system that needs to be considered in a move to a republic. The second part is the Australian parliamentary system. Australia uses a parliamentary system at both levels of government. Real political power lies with the majority in the lower house of the parliament. The head of state, the monarch, represented by the Governor-General, acts on the advice of the government and has little, if any, real power. And how much real power they have is controversial. But even though that's the system in practice, as a matter of law, the Constitution confers all the executive power on the Queen and the Governor-General. And the exercise of that power is controlled through constitutional conventions or practice, not through law. Conventions are practices that are almost invariably followed, but are not legally enforceable. And in Australia, there's uncertainty and has sometimes been controversy about the extent to which constitutional convention allows the Governor-General to exercise a discretion in crisis-type situations. For example, if a government can't get its budget through the upper house of Parliament. Yeah. Okay, sure. Think of the questions while we're trying to fix the echo. No, it's a really strange story. We ready? Look, is that better? Yeah? Brilliant. Okay. All right. So we've talked about two of the features of the Australian system: federalism, parliamentary system. And I know you have a presidential system, so we compare systems later if you're interested in that. But the third feature that we need to talk about is the way in which the national constitution is changed. Because at that level, at the national level, the constitution can only be changed by a referendum on a constitution alteration bill passed by both houses of the Commonwealth Parliament. In order for a referendum to pass, we need double majorities, not just the 45%, 50% national majority, which is needed, but we also need majorities in a majority of states. We have 6 states, so we need majorities in at least 4 states for a referendum to pass. Voting is compulsory in Australia, so there's always at least a 97% turnout or something like that. And the record of success at referendums is very bad. Only 8 out of 44 have been passed since Federation. No referendum has passed since 1977. No referendum has even been attempted since 1999. And that was the referendum on the Republic. It was rejected not just by a national majority, but by majorities in 5 out of the 6 states. I happen to live in the state that voted yes. So I regard that as a great plus for my own state of Victoria. However, in thinking about that 1999 result, don't exaggerate it. They were very peculiar circumstances in 1999. The then Prime Minister actually was opposed to becoming a republic, but he had inherited the Republican process from his predecessor, who then lost the election. So the Prime Minister was not just running dead, he was really running interference against the success of the referendum. And that created a political dynamic that probably won't occur again. So it's a little bit hard to work out what effect 1999 might have. So against that background, just think about what needs to be changed in the Constitution to become a republic. There's broad acceptance that the parliamentary system would be retained. So there's no plan to move to a presidential system of the kind that you have. There's potential for some confusion about that, but the overwhelming intention is to remain a parliamentary system with a non-executive Republican head of state. So what would we need to do to get that? We'd need to take all the references to the monarch and the Governor-General out of the Constitution. And there are a lot of them. You know, I can't remember, but it's something like 50. So you can imagine the number of actual changes that need to be made just to do that. Then we would need to replace them with a reference to a new office of head of state. What would that be called? I mean, the likelihood it'll be called president, just because that's what everyone else does. But there was recently a proposal just before I left Australia that an Indigenous elder might be appointed to the position. And it's not inconceivable that we might find an Indigenous name for the head of state. But most importantly, the change to the Constitution would need to provide for the appointment and removal of the new head of state. And that's a real problem, getting agreement on that. And it would also need to deal with the powers of the head of state. So what would we do? Would we continue with the existing Constitution, conferring all executive power on the new head of state, which seems like a weird thing to do, but they might do that, assuming that the constitutional conventions would continue to apply? Or would we try and spell out the powers and discretions of the head of state? And there would be a huge argument about what they are if we decide to go down that path. And then in addition to all that, we need to break the links with the Crown at the state level. Now, how am I going for time? Are we okay for a little while longer? Yeah? Okay, right, okay. I won't speed up in that case. So let me try to explain to you the controversy about how to appoint a new non-executive Republican head of state. This was the real sticking point in the debate in 1999. And there was then, and I'm pretty sure there still is, disagreement over the following alternatives. Should the head of state be appointed by the government? That's effectively what happens now. The head of state's appointed by the Queen or the King, but on the advice of the government. And we assume that the head of state would be removed by the monarch on the advice of the government. And so, as you can imagine, governments like that model. That's the model that governments prefer. Let's just have a Republican head of state effectively appointed by the Prime Minister and removable by the Prime Minister. However, that's so unrespectable that you need to find better alternatives. So another possibility is that the head of state might be elected by the Parliament, perhaps with a special majority. The only problem with that is that it doesn't take account of the federal system. Where is the consent of the states in all that? So another possibility is the head of state might be elected by the Parliament in a way that also involves the states in some remote way or other. And that's more or less the system in India. And the final option, which most voters seem to prefer, is that the head of state is directly elected by the people. And that's a very popular option in these days when politicians are not very popular. And there are precedents for it elsewhere in the world. The President of Ireland, for example, is a non-executive president in a parliamentary system elected by popular vote. So those are the options that will be discussed, and very different views on where the final decision should land. A related problem is that there was disagreement, and there still might be, about whether the head of state could be just dismissed by the Prime Minister if they exceed their powers, for example, or whether there should be some formal impeachment process justifying the removal of the head of state. I think the general public find it a bit harder to understand this issue, but it's part and parcel of the whole question about how you appoint this person. And then underlying these differences of views about whether the head of state should be appointed by the government or elected by the people are genuine concerns and uncertainty about the way in which those different choices might affect the operation of the parliamentary system. So, for example, if the so-called non-executive head of state is directly elected, will that give them greater legitimacy so that they will interfere more with the government that draws its authority from the parliament? It's even argued that if the head of state is elected by the parliament, that might give them too much legitimacy. So there's some really probably genuine concerns about whether the system itself would be destabilized. Whether that would matter is another question, but that's an issue. So all of this needs to be tackled if a republic comes back on the agenda. So this is the latest news from Australia on the Republic. Even as the Queen grew older, there were Republican rumblings in Australia, New Zealand, and some other realms. The Australian Republican movement came to life and put forward a model of some kind for the Republic. The Caribbean country of Barbados became a republic, and it seems very likely that other Caribbean states will do exactly the same in the near future. So the idea of a republic has been gradually bubbling up for the last few years. Second development, the new Australian government, elected earlier this year, appointed a minister for the Republic. That's the first time I've ever noticed that happening. Nobody's expecting the minister to be terribly active in the near future, but it's a very important straw in the wind. In terms of constitutional change, however, the priority of the current government, and for that matter, I think of most commentators, including me, is not the Republic, but change to the Constitution to provide what's called a voice to Parliament for the First Nations of Australia, the Indigenous people. This debate on whether there should be a body inserted into the Constitution with the responsibility of speaking to the Parliament for the Indigenous people of Australia, even if only in an advisory capacity, that's been going on for about 5 years now. And the current government is committed to that as well. And it seems very likely that a referendum on that will be run in the latter part of next year. So keep an eye on that. It's terribly important, if it's going to be run, that it actually passes. So with all of that on the agenda, it's been made clear by the government that it's not going to pursue a republic in its current term of office. We have 3-year parliaments, so its current term expires in 2025. If it's re-elected, which seems very likely, who knows, but seems likely at the moment, then we can expect the republic to be actively pursued by the government. And again, everybody will be watching to see what public opinion is as the death of the Queen becomes a memory, but as the new king is crowned next year. So there's a real question what the process might look like. Let's say 2025 comes and the government says, okay, let's go for it, let's have a republic. How are they actually going to go about it, given the record at referendum and given the difficult changes that need to be negotiated? Let me make some suggestions to you, but your guess is as good as mine at this point. I think there would be cooperative negotiations between the levels of government. Weirdly, in 1999, the model that was put to referendum didn't do anything about the monarchy at the state level. It just assumed that Australia would become a republic at the national level, and then gradually the states would break their own links with the crown, which on any view is a very messy idea. I don't think they do it that way again. Secondly, of course, the challenge will be to develop a model on which Australians will agree to the extent of actually voting yes and meeting those two referendum hurdles. And that will, that movement, that popular movement will need not just to persuade people about the model, but to persuade people to take an interest in this at all. There have been recent polls saying that this is an old person's idea. The baby boomers are keen on the Republic. Young people couldn't care less one way or another. They have other problems. So any sort of popular movement may well involve just getting people interested in the first place. And how do you go about doing that? Well, interestingly, since the last Republican referendum, 30 years or so ago now, there have been huge developments in the ways in which you make and change constitutions so as to involve the people more broadly. And this is true of Indonesia, isn't it? I mean, your constitution was changed with those 4 major waves of alterations over the turn of the century, but again, by a popular that wasn't particularly inclusive. There's been a lot of experimentation with inclusive constitutional change since then. Greater emphasis on the need for public involvement, not just in making new constitutions, but in changing existing ones. New deliberative processes to try to forge agreement on matters of this kind. For example, Ireland really spearheaded the use of deliberative bodies called citizens' assemblies, which it has used to change its constitution on some quite controversial points, such as abortion and same-sex marriage. And there are also, in the sort of the modern communications age, all sorts of new ways of informing people about constitutional issues and constitutional change. So there is room for creativity. Whether governments will occupy that room remains to be seen, but they would be wise to do so. So let me just wrap up. You've all been very patient, particularly given the echo. So this has been a very brief sketch of some inevitably complex issues that Australia and all those other 13 to 14 realms, the ones that still keep the monarch, will have to face in due course. Even though the issues are shared with all those other former colonies, in many ways, however, it's a very Australian story as well, because I hope you can see from my sort of outline of the Australian system that the particular problems that becoming a republic face in Australia are shaped by Australian history and by Australian political and constitutional culture. Even more complicated than in 1991, the question of the Republic is now interwoven with the question of reconciliation with First Nations peoples. And it's interwoven with that in at least 2 ways. One, the First Nations peoples are very bitter about colonisation, as you can probably imagine. And so during all the events that occurred following the death of the Queen, there were a lot of Indigenous Australians saying, well, we actually don't care. We're not fond of her anyway. So that decolonisation discontent is certainly alive and well amongst First Nations peoples. But the other way in which the issue of Indigenous recognition and reconciliation comes in is that Indigenous people and others say the Republic is not a priority. The voice to Parliament is. Don't muddle the 2 issues up together. As you can see also, I hope from what I've said, in many ways this is a global constitutional issue of a kind. Australia can draw on the constitutional experiences of others. It will look at Ireland. It will look at India. It may look at even countries' parliamentary systems outside the common law context. It probably won't look at presidential systems just because that would be too great a change, I think, in the Australian context. Despite all that, nothing significant is likely to happen before 2025. If something happens next year, you can think of me and say she got that wrong, but I don't think it will. But after 2025, if you're still interested in these matters, you should keep an eye on what's going on. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Sarah Saunders. Before we continue to get the lecture from Professor Satya, I've been told from that there are some students that will have another lecture at 7 o'clock. So if you want to stay, please. But if you must attend another lecture, so please. Okay. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Satya Arinanto to give the lecture responding about the republicanism. Please, Professor Satya.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Usually, especially Professor Saunders, Mr. Adi Aman, and Pak Ari, and other lectures. I try to make a short presentation on the struggle to transform Australia into a republic, during and after the second Elizabethan era. Okay, let's start. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Sarah Saunders to all of you here at Universitas Indonesia or University of Indonesia, Depok campus. She has had many past appearances here actually, and is one of the most senior professor in constitutional law in the Asia Pacific region, whom I admire and respect very much. For Professor Saunders and I, this is the second opportunity we have been given to provide a public lecture in the Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia. Okay, next. Her first time here at the faculty, I think, was around 1995, if I'm not mistaken, where she delivered a public lecture about the Australian Constitution at the Moot Court Room at the time. I was the moderator, alongside Dr. Graham Masal at the time. Dr. Graham Masal was working in the Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies, Melbourne Law School, University of Melbourne at the time in 1990s, I think. And actually, Professor Saunders and I have known each other for around 30 years, I think, 30 years, and have been working together to publish many exciting books and deliver international workshop on key topics, as shown on the next slide. This is not complete, actually some books are missing, because it's already around 30 years, but this is the sample of our work. I'm helping her, I mean, in publishing some books, Journalists was very limited at the time, but books nggak muncul itunya, yang gambar buku sebelumnya, belum itu, terus I still keep the books, but only 7, I think, maybe around more than 3 already missing in my library, maybe, or somewhere else, I don't know. I think, one yearbook of 1993 and some proceeding, I think. And this is our picture in one of the international conference occasion. Maybe I forgot, is it in Taiwan or in Singapore? Okay, next. Yeah. The scope of, actually the public lecture already delivered by her, so I don't have to explain this part. Okay, next. Yeah, I try to make a short presentation here. Actually, I just try to make a summary from many reading materials provided for me from the committee and also from some other sources. Yeah. Okay, next. Yeah, some of this already been delivered also by Professor Saunders. Yeah. In recent years, several parliamentary democracies have considered replacing hereditary monarchs. Yeah. The most visible remnant of the pre-democratic era with popularly chosen presidents and a republican form of government. This democratic reform is not an easy to make. Yeah. However, because it involves combining the well-established sovereignty of parliaments who may stake their own claim to sovereignty and popular support in clashes with prime ministers and their cabinets. Yeah. Selecting presidents, limiting their power, and ensuring that they remain above the political prey are tricky matters. Yeah. There is a risk that constitutional power and balances will be upset. Yeah. Group favoring or opposing the adoption of a presidential office often have more sweeping agendas, that are not easily compromised. Yeah, I couldn't see some word, it's too small. Okay, I will continue to the next page. Yeah. These difficulties were abundantly evident in the struggle to transform Australia into a republic, which culminated on 6 November 1999, as also explained by Professor Saunders, in a constitutional referendum on the adoption of a republican form of government. The proposed change will have replaced the British Queen and her representative, the Governor General, with a president appointed by 2/3 of Australia's bicameral Commonwealth Parliament sitting as one body. Australians, however, voted 55 to 45% against this proposal, with majorities in all 6 states and the Northern Territory rejecting it. Only the Capital Territory, where Canberra is located, registered a majority in favor. Okay, next. A second referendum proposal to add a preamble to the Constitution was even more soundly defeated. Yet opinion polls have showed that less than 10% of those who voted against the referendum like having the Queen and Australia's head of state, and that between a third and a half of those who voted no, depending on how polling questions were worded, will have voted yes if the referendum had proposed a directly elected president instead of one chosen by parliament. In other words, for an electorally decisive number of voters, the proposed republic did not seem sufficiently democratic. Okay, next. Page 5, Several other parliamentary democracies headed by the British Queen are also debating whether to become republics. In Britain itself, there has long been significant sentiment for replacing the constitutional monarchy with a republic. And some observers regard the Tony Blair's government elimination of more than 600 hereditary peers in the House of Lords as a step in this direction. In Canada, for example, a September 99 poll recorded 48% supporting and 43% opposing retention of this to the Queen, with the rest coincided. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Jim Bolger endorsed republicanism in 1994. And in the 1999 election campaign, Helen Clark, the Labour Party, the Labour Party leader, who subsequently became Prime Minister, proposed holding a constitutional convention in 2000 to consider changing to Republican form of government. In Canada and New Zealand, the Republic option confronts major difficulties. In particular, it is unclear how it will affect the situation of the respective indigenous peoples, and whether it will quell Quebec's succession. So, a vote on changing the form of government must be judged unlikely for some time to come. Republicanism is high on the political agenda. However, in three of Britain's former Caribbean colonies, like Barbados, Belize, and Jamaica. In Barbados, for example, a Governor General controversial decision in June 1994 to dissolve Parliament prematurely led to the formation of a government commission charged with examining the country's link to the crown. And also there are an example for Australia also. Next, as described above, referendum in Australia have generally had limited success. It's already been delivered also previously by Professor Saunders. Of the 44 attempts to amend the Constitution, only 8 have been successful. In order to succeed, a referendum must be approved by a majority of electors overall, and a majority of states, i.e. 4 out of 6, for example. Referendums are regulated under the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act 1984. The 1999 referendum of an Australian republic had been preceded by several years of formal activity initiated by Prime Minister Paul Keating in 1993 with the establishment of Republican Advisory Committee. I recall Professor Sheryl Sanders wrote an article on the issues of republicanism in the Asia Pacific Constitutional Yearbook 1993. At the time, I think there were 2 issues, republicanism and native title, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Next. In 1996, Prime Minister John Howard formally confirmed his government intention to proceed the Constitutional Convention on this matter. The convention was held in February 1998 at Old Parliament House to consider various issues and proposals and to put forward a model for public parliamentary scrutiny. Half of 1952 delegates at 1998 conventions were elected through a non-compulsory postal vote, and half were appointed by federal and state governments. Convention of delegates were tasked to considering 3 questions. I took from the sources. First, whether or not Australia should become a republic. Second, which model for a republic might be put to the Australian electorate to consider against the current system of government. And the third question, in what time frame and under what circumstances might any change be considered? Okay, I will jump to the next page. Of the 3 questions considers, the convention first supported in principle the idea that Australia should become a republic. This resolution was carried by 89 votes to 62 with 11 abstention. And second, supported the bipartisan appointment of the president model by 73 votes in favor to 57 against with 22 abstentions. Well, this was less than an absolute majority. It was declared carried by the chair, and a motion of dissent in the chair's ruling was overwhelmingly defeated. And the third voted to recommend to the Prime Minister and Parliament that this model be put to a referendum by 133 votes and 217 with 2 abstention. Yeah, it recommended that the referendum be held in 1999, and that if successful, the republic should come into effect by 1 January 2001. Next, so the subsequent referendum was held on 6 November 1999. There are 2 big questions for dealing with the republic questions. Yeah, the question on the republic put to electors on the 1999 referendum was whether they approve of a proposed law to alter the constitution to establish the Commonwealth of Australia as a republic with the Queen and Governor General being replaced by a president appointed by a 2/3 majority of the members of the Commonwealth Parliament. And dealing with the preamble questions, yeah, electors were also asked to vote on the second question at the 1999 referendum, which asks whether they approve of a proposed law to alter the constitution to insert a preamble. Okay, next, I will not read because you can find from the any source about the referendum outcome. It's one dealing with the republic questions. Yeah, for example, only Australian Capital Territory. Yeah, the result was yes, and the other state were no. And for the preamble questions, the result no for all states. Okay, next. The failure of the 1999 referendum, yeah, this is just quoting from some prominent scholars. For example, from Professor Helen Irving from Sydney Law School. She considered 3 hypotheses. Yeah. First, referendum have no chance if they lack wide cross-party support, and especially that of the Prime Minister. Yeah, this is the hypothesis, quote unquote, probably right. And then the second, the referendum addressed the aspiration of the elite and alienated the people like battlers. Yeah, hypothesis seems intuitively correct, but it is unclear where the battlers wanted to change the constitution or were opposed because they preferred a direct election model. And the third, insufficient voter knowledge of the issues and implication hypothesis and has greater difficulty, given that a positive correlation between formal education and support for a republic has existed over a number of years. Next, yeah, there was also a statement or research from Professor Ian McAllister from NU, concluded that from his 1999 Australian constitutional study, that the most important influence on voting was views about whether or not to sever the link with Britain, followed by a positive and negative aspect of the proposed change and the views presented by the leaders and the respective yes and no campaign. Voter knowledge of politics was also important. So overall, the interaction between compulsory voting and lack of political knowledge among large section of the electorate served to divide Republicans and cause the proposition of to fail. Pairing the Republic with armed popular change to the preamble of the Constitution also depressed the yes vote. Next, last but not least, also from Justice Michael Kirby, yeah, he said that, or he suggested that the referendum failure emerged from 10 errors of process, yeah, politics and time frame, yeah, like the partition error, the haste error, the great elitist error, the patriotism error, the convention error, yeah, the model error, and some other errors. Okay, next, I think this is a short thing about the future, yeah. After the second Elizabethan era is over. Yeah. I have to a bit maybe I have to upload. The death of Queen Elizabeth II has instantly reignited discussion about an Australian Republic. Yeah, with the Green Leader, I read in the Guardian, for example, Adam Brand using a condolence message to the British monarch to again push for the constitutional change. Yeah, yeah. He tweeted that rest in peace, Queen Elizabeth II. Our thoughts are with her family and all who love her. Now Australia must move forward. We need treaty and with First Nation people, and we need to become republic. And then also the Australian Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is a long-time supporter of Australian becoming a republic, but declined to engage with such question, yeah, at the time, yeah, on Friday morning news, yeah, and the ABC TV. Okay, next. There is also the Australian Republic movement, which pair their tribute to the Queen in a statement like this. Many Australians have known no other head of state. Yeah, the leg of the heroine was unrivaled. As monarch, Queen Elizabeth, as a patron of more than 600 organizations, and served them admirably. She rose to become a respected representative of Britain and the Commonwealth. And that group also noted that the Queen respected the self-determination of the Australian people. And other statement. Next, there is also a statement from Peter Fitzsimon, yeah, the IRM National Chair, who said that during her reign, Australia has grown into a mature and independent nation. It is unlikely we will ever see a monarch as a respected or admired by the Australian people again. And also Alexander Walt, the Australian Monarchs League, acknowledged there will be a discussion about republic in the wake of the Queen death, but called for a degree of civility and respect. Yeah. People have different views, and it's important to consider those views with maturity and intelligence. Yeah. But I don't think that now is the right time for those views. Yeah. You know, we are going to spend probably a fortnight in mourning, and that will have really what matters. This is also, next. I could also statement from a media release, yeah, I think, yeah. This is a media release from an organization, yeah. But I will not read it. I quote from Guardian.com. Okay, I think this is all from me right now. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Satya Arinanto. Professors, my appreciation and gratitude to the all of you who has been delivered the lecture. And so I would like to invite participant in this room, and also I forgot to greet the participant in Zoom. And please, if you have a question, post in the maybe chat, Mas Dewa, we can summary from that. But first, I would like to invite maybe 2 or 3 participants in this room to deliver questions, maybe to Professor Satya or Professor Cheryl Saunders. Questions? This is very interesting, right? Both professors said the constitutional changes is very important. Back to back in Australia, 1999, they tried to change the republic monarch, maybe part of the monarchy to become a republic. How to elect the head of state. Also, we here in Indonesia had the same experience. Wants to change the constitution, but at that time, we are agreed to strengthen the unity of the Republic of Indonesia and also strengthening the presidentialism system. So yeah, this is maybe a little summary from those two professors. Students, any questions? Maybe from Zoom, Mas Dewa, any question? Is it possible we invite directly? Okay. Any question from Pak Gaston? Is it from Zadi Taqwa? Okay. Mas Zadi Taqwa, are you there? One of our young lecturer. Actually, he went to the Melbourne Law School, Professor. Zadi Taqwa, can you unmute yourself and
Hi everyone. Hello Bang. Hi Professor
Hi.
Cheryl. It's me Muhammad. So there were a lot of researchers that have been guided by Professor Cheryl. So welcome to Indonesia. First of all, my question is that, as you said before, we know that every form of state, either republic or monarch, has its own implications. My question is that, what are the disadvantages of being a monarch for Australia? So, because when we compare whether this form of state has some benefits or have some drawbacks, it will be more persuasive to invite the people who wants to promote Republic for Australia. But I think that's the only question that I have. Thank you, Professor.
thank you, Muhammad Zadi Taqwa. Is there any question? Any other participant that wants to deliver directly? Okay. Question from Bapak Gaston Suhadi. Are you still there, Bapak Gaston? Okay, maybe. Oh yes, please. You can please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Perhaps this is for Professor Saunders. Given the present conditions of Australian society today, will it make a huge difference actually if Australia become a republic? Is it important, as you say, because today, as you say, that the most important priority for Australia is to give the First Nations a voice to the parliament. So in relation to that, whether the issue of Australia becoming a republic is actually make a huge difference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Gaston. Maybe last question in this session, Pak Wira. Please unmute yourself, Pak.
Hi, thank you. I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
To the questions, I know it's not the little policy for Australia. And the question, how if this policy was applied in Australia, then the chaos happened in Australia. How the government solve the chaos due to the policy? Thank you.
Can you repeat, pardon? How the government will manage the chaos, maybe?
Yeah, how can, if this policy was applied in Australia and the chaos happened, how the government solve the chaos?
The chaos in the constitutional changes or in the
chaos due to the policy that they applied about Australia public.
Oh, when the possibility appear. Okay, thank you. So, there are 3 questions. Professor Seno, please.
Well, thank you for the questions. Before I answer them, can I address something in Professor Arananto's lecture? Because I said in my lecture that my state of Victoria voted in favour, and he said it didn't, and he's right, because he put the statistics up there. So I misremembered. It was my electorate, I think, that voted in favour. I just extrapolated that into the state as a whole. So on his figures, the results are even worse than on mine. So I just wanted to make that correction and say how much I enjoyed his insights. Now, thank you for those questions, some of which actually overlap, I think. The first 2 in particular. And the first one was, what would be the advantages of going down this path? And the second one was, would it make any difference? And really, of course, the answer is probably not. The whole idea of national identity, people can get worked up about it, but it's pretty intangible. And if the monarchy has been massaged so that it looks more or less Australian, the Governor-General's always an Australian, the monarch's called the Monarch of Australia, even the identity issue is softened. As a constitutional lawyer, I'm inclined to think that there are advantages in the system being more transparent. It's extremely hard to understand how this constitutional monarchy works under the Australian Constitution. If you just look at the Constitution, you get an entirely different view of what's going on. So I think that there are some advantages if they would use the opportunity to clarify the system of government and make people feel much more connected with their system of government. The other possible change is that it might just shake up the existing representative system. Now, in Australia, as I'm sure elsewhere, people are a bit disengaged from their elected representatives. They're regarded as a political class. And anything that sort of shakes that up and makes the democracy more real could potentially be good. If it, as long as it works in practice. But we're already seeing some changes to the Australian political system. For example, at the last election, 15 independent members were elected, almost all of them women, almost all of them not political, just fed up with the way the system was working. And that in itself is changing the operation of the parliament. So it may be that, a change to the monarchy is not going to make that much different in that regard anyway. So the answer is very hard to identify tangible benefits, and particularly hard for younger generations who don't care much about the Constitution anyway, or so they say. So the third question, how should the government deal with the chaos? I think the government's trying to organise the debate on the Republic so that there isn't any chaos. Indeed, the idea of minimalism, which Professor Aranetto articulated, is designed to minimize the difference. You know, it really won't make much difference. We'll just slip in a president instead of a governor general and everything will go on as it did before. But one, that's unlikely to be acceptable. And secondly, every time you change a constitution, every time you make a significant change to a constitution, there is an implementation period when you need to pay attention to the new arrangements being properly put in place. So I interpret that chaos question as going a little bit to the challenge of implementation. And it would be very important. If Australia changes the constitution to provide for a Republican head of state, it will be very important for the first person who holds that office to be someone that people are pleased to have as their head of state, whatever that means, for someone who can set the pattern of the relationship with the elected branches of government and with the courts. So I completely agree that there would be a settling in period. I don't think the politicians are thinking about it that way, but my own experience tells me that that's likely to be true. Want to say anything?
Cause you see, I'm a dinosaur. Should have died out a long time before. There's a whole lot of dinosaurs. Give us our hats. Excuse me, man, but where is the door? Get us our hats. Excuse me, man. Where
Okay. Something happens. That's how life works, right? Okay, thank you for the question from Zoom. And now I also would like to invite students here in this room, in this chamber. Anyone? Don't you have any questions, please? Don't be shy. Okay, please. Bu Mutiara.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to know about your opinion, Prof. Saunders. Do you support or do you agree Republic for Australian? Yes, this question. Thank you.
Very straight questions. Please, Professor.
Multiple microphones here now. Look, yes, I would, in principle, vote for a republic. I think it's common sense. I think it will happen eventually, not necessarily in my lifetime. But I would also want the model to be good. If a question is put whereby the government of the day appoints and dismisses the head of state, I would be torn. So as a constitutional lawyer, we want our institutions to work effectively, and I don't think it's appropriate for the head of state who, while he or she has to act on the advice of the Prime Minister, nevertheless is a bit of a check and balance in the system. And so I think it's important that that office be constituted properly. So I'm pretty sure I did vote yes in 1999, but I would have done it reluctantly because I thought the model was hopeless. not just for the key reasons that Professor Arananto articulated, but because the Prime Minister was going to be able to dismiss the president, and they didn't deal with the states, and they didn't deal with the powers, and it was just a mess. So, in principle, yes, but I do think that the decision on the model is important.
We need the audio to be here in Zoom.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to ask something that I wonder how democracy and sovereignty maintained in Australia, because Indonesia has no experience in Commonwealth or so whatsoever, and when we are independent, we stayed as independent country and then no longer related to other countries. My question would be, I wonder how democracy works while another country able to control your countries. And the second one, I see how reluctant the citizen in Australia to vote to become independent, even though the sovereignty, whatever it means, has no solid, in my opinion, sovereignty, because a monarchy system in UK may change and intervene the local or Australia national government. My first question, how it creates the balance in democracy, or maybe there is a pseudo democracy that we don't know happens, because many Australians, of course, come from UK and inheritance, and then their ancestor also come from UK. And the second one, as you mentioned about national identity, it brings me in the question about the local indigenous that you already mentioned a lot, that people should have their sovereignty and rights in their own land and their own government, and their voices in the part of civil and political rights, while it's become part of human rights and in what it means by human rights, needs to be solved independently without any of intervention of maybe UK or a monarchy. I, as Indonesian, maybe has no vision on those. How democracy works is that pseudo democracy, because many of Australians come from the UK ancestors or much. But I see the potential, because I see many of migration and then transnational changes in local and international, which bring many of the maybe parliament members maybe not come from the ancestors of UK, or maybe many of race and many of variety of values on how they believe in independence. So I'm questioning why people would reluctant for their own independence, in sole independence, while for many of us common thing, in my opinion, it's easy. Yeah, we want fully independent, but in Australia it's very different, or maybe there is a paradigm or maybe cultural issues that happening inside Australian, or maybe people are already fed up with political issues, or maybe why is that happen? That's my question. Thank you.
Let me see if I can answer those very interesting and rather complex questions. So nobody regards this as about independence or sovereignty. Really what I was trying to explain, that the process of acquiring independence over the 20th century really is complete. Australia doesn't know or care what the British think about our policies or anything else, and the British have no say in anything that Australia decides to do. Even the monarch, if and when the king or queen does anything in relation to Australia, which is rare, will do whatever they're doing on the advice of the Australian Prime Minister. No British involvement at all. Now, I know that's weird. And I also know that it's probably quite hard for newcomers to Australia to understand. But it's made possible partly because of the way the common law constitutional tradition works, with reliance on constitutional practice, but also because by complete chance, the way the Australian Constitution was made gives us an alternative story. So in 1901, before Australia became independent, the Constitution was actually passed by the British Parliament. But the Constitution that they passed was drawn up in Australia by constitutional conventions elected by Australians, and the draft was approved by referendums in Australia before it was sent off to be formally enacted. And so if you think about it, there's the imperial story, which is the one you're referring to, but there's the popular sovereignty story, which is the one Australians now think about. And even the High Court, our highest court, has now said the authority for the Australian Constitution lies with the Australian people. And there's actually no doubt about this. So it's almost like smoke and mirrors. You know, what you see looks peculiar. The way in which it works and the way in which it's understood is completely consistent, or as consistent as possible, with democracy and sovereignty. Now, of course, you're right that in the world of the 21st century, both democracy and sovereignty are compromised in all sorts of ways by the way the world is developing. You know, they're as alive and well in Australia as they are anywhere else, subject to these, you know, leftovers of empire that the Republic would deal with. If I can just briefly say something about Indigenous people, it's really hard to explain how that's wrapped up in all of this. I think if the Voice passes next year, there will be an even greater push from Indigenous Australians for the Republic. It's possible that the two issues will be seen to be wrapped up. Now we've dealt with, well, partly dealt with, the question of reconciliation with Indigenous people. Will never be fully dealt with, but partly dealt with. Now we move on to the last step, which is dealing with final remnants of the relationship with the colonizers. And there's a lot going on with the First Nations relationship at the moment. I talked about the national movement to have a voice to Parliament, and that's a live debate in Australia. But at the state level, different states are negotiating treaties with their Indigenous people. So in my state of Victoria, there's now a First Nations elected assembly. It's negotiating, or it's positioning itself to negotiate a treaty with the state government to cover state Indigenous relations. And these are really important major developments if they're finally brought to fruition, which could change Australia more than any of these other sort of debates on the Republic are likely to do. I hope that's helpful.
No, it's okay. Very interesting. So let me invite another participant from Zoom. I saw that Ibu Lena. Am I right? Ibu Lena, you have been raise your hand in Zoom. Could you please unmute yourself and give some?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
please, ma'am.
Like
Thank you.
Professor Arinanto. So what is the impact to Indonesia if the Australian become a republic? And that's a very first question. And the second question for the Professor Cyril, that's have you learned something from Indonesia? Because Indonesia has been long time as a Indonesian become republic. So what have you learned from Indonesia that maybe the best practices or anything that you can learn from Indonesia? And thank you. I'm Lena, the ambassador of Indonesia in Kuwait, for Kuwait. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Lena, His Excellency. So, Professor Satya.
Thank you, Ibu Ambassador Nana. Actually, I think we are not practicing the bicameralism. I think three-cameralism, because we know that there is a House of Representative or DPR, and then People Consultative Assembly or MPR, and also Regional Representative Council, or Dewan Perwakilan Daerah. I think, still we have to strengthen the Regional Representative Council role now. That's one from the three institutions. I think how to balance the power, I think, between the House of Representative, Regional Representative Council, and also the People Consultative Assembly. That's one of the constitutional problem here now. That's in my opinion, dealing with your questions. Thank you very much, Ibu Ambassador, for attending this public lecture by Professor Saunders. Okay, please, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Look, a couple of points about Indonesia. The first is, as I suggested in my lecture, we have, I think, no intention of becoming a parliamentary system of the kind you have here. But there is a lot of potential for confusion just because the same term would be used for this non-executive head of state, or is likely to be used. So one way of sort of using the Indonesian example is actually to say, Indonesia has a presidential system. We are not intending to do that. We are intending simply to have a parliamentary system with a head of state who also happens to be called a president, as in Ireland. So Indonesia is quite a good case study because it's a neighbour for us to be able to explain what we're not trying to do, not because it doesn't work here, but just because that's not the intention. But there's another thing that a much more constructive thing that I've learned from Indonesia. And that is from your experience of constitutional reform. The way in which Indonesia went about dramatically changing its constitutional system in those 4 stages over that period of years really has a lot to tell Australia and the rest of the world. A lot to tell how you go about building coalitions for really difficult decisions in a large and complex country. A lot to tell about how you don't necessarily need to do everything at once, that sometimes you do what's manageable, as long as you keep your eye on the need to take further steps further down the track. And I think the Indonesian case is nothing like as well known as it should be for those reasons. And Australia has a lot to learn. I mean, you can tell from Professor Arananto's description of the reactions to the Republican referendum, that debate, should we do minimalism or should we do the Big Bang? What Indonesia tells us, there might be a middle way. And I think that's actually pretty important.
Do we have another questions, Mas Dewo? Oh, yeah, okay, please, Mas. Bisa tolong pass the microphone.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question, but sorry, I can't really speak English very fluently. Yeah, I will try to speak in English. Just now, when you give a presentation, you was talking about how to choose the president. Is it directly by the people of the Australia or by the head of the states? Maybe in my question, I will ask how you like to choose the way to choosing the president. That's it. Just that is my question. That is my question. Thank you.
How would I like to choose the president? Well, now I'm going to be revealed as a revolutionary. Frankly, I'd go for a popular vote. But if we do that, you see, we have to actually say in the Constitution what the president's supposed to do. So that becomes a bigger exercise. I don't think that's impossible either, but I think it will be hard to get agreement across the political parties, not from the people. I think it'll be hard to get agreement on passing a bill through the parliament. So that's my preference. I think the system in Ireland works very well. And I really don't see why we couldn't do much the same.
Okay. Maybe considering the limitation of the time, the last two questions will be from the Zoom. Here we have Bapak Rifki and Joe that has been raised their hand in Zoom. Pak Rifki, please unmute yourself.
Boleh, terima kasih. Let me introduce myself. My name is Rifki. I'm the student of Professor Satya from doctoral degree from University of Universitas Kristen Indonesia. I have two questions for Prof. Saunders. The first is that if we understand the colonialism throughout the world, actually they do the exploitations of many resources for the benefit of the monarch ecosystem. Is that also happened to Australia? So that's why some of Australian want to have another form of the country become a republic. And then the second question is that by being a republic, do you think that Australians have more freedom to control the whole Australian resources for the best benefit for Australia people? So that's two questions for Prof. Saunders. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we lost the participant, the last participant. Okay, so please, Professor, answer from Rifki.
Yeah, look, it's an important question, and it's a very important question for decolonization in all sorts of parts of the world. The answer to it is that in the early years of Australian colonization, two things happened. One, the Indigenous people were terribly treated, completely dispossessed, pushed off their lands, lost their country, lost their resources. But those losses were really in favour of the new settlers who'd arrived, most of whom were English or British or Irish at the time. And quite quickly, Australians acquired reasonable control of their own resources. I'm sure that Britain was still compulsorily the main market for a long time, although that's long since changed. But from the British point of view, while they sort of grievously exploited places like India, for example, Australia was a little bit less easy to exploit. It was further away, it was expensive to run. And by the time the gold rushes hit, for example, in the 19th century, Australia had self-government and really kept a lot of those resources for itself. So the issue of resources that you raise is still experienced by the First Nations, by the Indigenous people. And one of the purposes of the treaty processes at the state level is to give them back lands, compensate them to some extent for losses. That will have a resource impact. But Australia is not in the same situation that, say, India or Malaysia was as a result of colonization.
Okay, the last answer is a very interesting, the most interesting for my side. But apologize for the participant. The time is very limited. I understand that Professor Sanders, Cheryl will be attending another occasion meeting in DPR, if I'm not mistaken. And also Prof. Satya has another agenda. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Satya Rinanto, Professor Cheryl Sanders. Do you have any or the last remarks from this session, for this session? Professor Satya?
There was a joke, during the New Order era. Our president met with the Australian Prime Minister. At the time, the issue of republicanism, I think from 1990, 1990, And our president asked to the Australian Prime Minister, "Why do you want to be a republic?" Because we want to change, to transform from republic to the monarchy. That's only the joke at the time. Yeah.
Yes, not a monarchy like this one. Yes, can I just also thank you all for your hospitality? Say what a great pleasure it's been to see my friend Satya Arinanto again. You know, he said that we met 30 years ago. You know, he came to Australia as what we called a young scholar in those days. So it shows you plenty of time has passed since then, and we've kept in touch from time to time. So it's really lovely to see him again on his home ground and to meet other colleagues here at the law school. So thank you very much, and thank you all for your interest in this rather peculiar topic.
Okay, thank you, Professor Cheryl and Professor Satya Arinanto. Please applause. So if I may have some summary. Okay, some summary for students, in particular for students, that the idea of constitutional changes is very important in our department, constitutional law. You can learn not only from Indonesia experience, back to 1998, 1999, and so on, but also we can learn from another country that has been very established, well, in our perspective, like Australia, because they have their own experience, try to change the constitution, but fail. Yeah, plenty of room to make research, discussion, debate on that. So yeah, this is your floor, your challenge, your rooms to explore more. That might be conclude our session today. Thank you very much, Professor Satya Rinato, Professor Cheryl, to attend, to give lecture. Please applause once again. Thank you very much, students, participants in Zoom and also in this room. See you again. Oh, sorry. There's token of appreciation from our faculty. Please.